Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Mum Show virtual lecture. My name is Tim Johnson. I'm the director of the Botanic Garden of Smith College. Live transcription has been enabled for this webinar. Attendees can turn this feature on and off through the live transcription icon on the bottom of the webinar screen. A reminder that this year's Mum Show is closed to the general public. Members of the Smith College community in the testing protocol can get into Lyman with a 1 card. And friends of the Botanic Garden of Smith College who have proof of membership and who have pre-registered can get in for the Mum Show. Members, please check your email and mailbox for instructions about how to register, or email us at garden@smith.edu for assistance. For those of you who can't be with us in person, follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and sign up for our e-newsletter, Digitalis, on our website, garden.smith.edu. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it is that we can still experience authentic human connection over distances, time zones, and geopolitical boundaries, as long as the internet holds up. And that even during a pandemic, people are finding ways to enjoy a really good cup of coffee with a friend in parks and gardens, on long walks and front porches, virtually, and increasingly vaccine cards in hand at cafes together in real life. Coffee shops have served as intellectual, political, cultural, and community hotspots for centuries, all because of the magical caffeinating powers of Coffea. To celebrate that fact and to help us connect virtually, we thought it would be fun to showcase just how wide the audience for this event is by making a list of your favorite cafes. Thank you to those who have responded so far to our brief survey. We will be accepting responses to the end of day tomorrow, and then we'll be sharing the results back with you afterwards. It takes a coordinated effort for many people to make the Mum Show and tonight's event possible. Thank you to the friends of the Botanic Garden of Smith College and our financial supporters. Your gifts make our work possible. For those of you who are not yet members, you can join right now at garden.smith.edu/friends. I also want to thank the staff and students who have brought the Mum Show to life. Our greenhouse horticulturalists, Dan Babineau and Lily Carone, as well as our student assistants, Marge Poma, Sasha Zeidenberg, Mai Klooster, and Abigail Dustin. For a really great article featuring Mai and Sasha, visit the Greek Court Gate at smith.edu/news. I also want to thank our ITS support tonight, Brad Wakeholtz. Thank you, Brad. And finally, I want to introduce Sarah Loomis, our Manager of Education, and thank Sarah for planning tonight's event. Sarah will then be introducing tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Tim. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sarada Krishnan tonight. Dr. Krishnan is Director of both Horticulture and the Center for Global Initiatives at the Denver Botanic Gardens, where she is responsible for directing the design and maintenance of the horticulture displays and collections, and for developing and leading global projects. She also serves as the Executive Director of the International Women's Coffee Alliance, whose mission is to empower women along the entire coffee supply chain to achieve meaningful and sustainable lives through programs and partnerships with the international coffee community. And as though she isn't busy enough, she also owns coffee plantations in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica. Dr. Krishnan has a Bachelor of Science in Horticulture from India with a focus on tropical horticulture. She has a Master's of Science degree in horticulture from Colorado State University with a research focus on the propagation of native Colorado flora, specializing in plant tissue culture. Her doctorate research at the University of Colorado Boulder focused on the conservation genetics of wild coffee, Coffea species, in Madagascar. In 2016 and 2017, Dr. Krishnan was involved in developing the global strategy for the conservation of coffee genetic resources in collaboration with the Global Crop Diversity Trust and World Coffee Research. The main goal of the strategy is to ensure the conservation and use of coffee genetic resources for a positive, sustainable future of the crop and for those dependent on coffee for a livelihood. She is a faculty affiliate with Colorado State University's Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture, and a member of the Board of Directors of Plant Select, a collaborative plant introduction program between Denver Botanic Gardens, Colorado State University, and the green industry of Colorado. She serves on the USDA National Genetic Resources Advisory Council and is the chair of the USDA's Coffee and Cacao Crop Germplasm Committee. She's on the board of Women First International Fund, a nonprofit organization providing small grants for grassroots projects that empower women and girls in developing countries. And finally, she has published numerous papers and chapters on coffee genetic resources, botanic gardens, and sustainable ag in peer-reviewed journals and books. We are thrilled to host her this evening. Sarada will be speaking for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will be hosting a Q&A. Questions can be submitted through the Q&A function, but we do ask that you wait until she's done speaking, and then we will open that up and Tim will be moderating. So welcome, Sarada. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Tim, for inviting me to be part of this lecture series, and I'm so thrilled to be here. And I am going to be talking about the science and culture of coffee. Okay, so I have broken my talk into several parts, and I'm hoping that I can get it done at about 30 to 45 minutes. So I may be going a little fast on some slides, but anyway, since this is being recorded, this will be something that you can watch later too. So I'll start with the botany of the crop, and then a little bit on the economics and a history of coffee as a beverage, processing of coffee, how it gets to the final stage that you get it in when you make your coffee, and the climate change impacts on coffee, and the development of the global coffee conservation strategy. And I'll talk finally about a little bit about the research project that I did in South Sudan, which the publication will be coming out soon. So coffee belongs to the Rubiaceae family and under the tribe Coffea. And there used to be only 11 genera under Coffea. There used to be 11 genera, and now it is 10 because the genus Xylanthus has been subsumed under Coffea. And so with the inclusion of Xylanthus under Coffea, there are 130 species of Coffea. And it used to be, before the inclusion of Xylanthus, it was mainly predominantly an African origin with Madagascar and some of the Indian Ocean islands. But with the inclusion of Xylanthus, the extent of its diversity spreads across India, Southeast Asia, and there was even one species in Australia. So the Coffea, there are 2 cultivated species. Of all the 130 species, only 2 are cultivated. The Arabica coffee, which is Coffea arabica, which you usually find in the stores, as well as the Coffea canephora, which is the robusta coffee, which is mostly used in instant coffee. And so the little bit of the genetics of this crop is the Arabica coffee is a tetraploid. It has 4 sets of chromosomes. And the Arabica is the only one that's a tetraploid. All the other species are 2 sets of chromosomes like we are, they're diploid, 22 sets of chromosomes. So the Arabica was a natural cross that happened between 2 species, the Coffea eugenioides and Coffea canephora in the wild. It was a natural cross, and there was a doubling of chromosomes that left it as a tetraploid. And because of the tetraploid nature of Arabica, it is a self-compatible species. That means it can self-pollinate and produce seeds without cross-pollination. And there are 2 other species that are also self-compatible in the genus Coffea. They are the Coffea heterocalyx and Coffea anthonii. And a little bit about the morphology and phenology. It is, I'm going to predominantly talk about the Arabica coffee. So it is a shrub or a small tree and can live up to 70 years. And the first flowering happens around the 3rd year. And by the time they reach full production potential, it is the 5th year. That is why it is an expensive crop, because it is a perennial crop for a farmer. It's not like an annual crop where they can replace when a pest or disease happens. Once you plant a new crop, it takes 5 years by the time you get full production potential. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the two main commercial species, Arabica and robusta. And then the coffee itself, if you look at the coffee cherry, if you look at the coffee, this is the fresh fruit, what we call coffee cherry. And then when you open it, there are two seeds inside the cherry. And within the seed itself, the outer skin is called the pericarp or the exocarp. And then you have the pulp, and there is a pectin layer. And then there is a parchment layer, silver skin, and inside is the beans. So when processing, once you harvest the crop, there are so many processing procedures that have to happen before you get the green coffee. So in this diagram, you can see where it is the dried coffee. And when you open up, you get this parchment coffee. You remove the parchment, you see the silver skin, and then you remove the silver skin, and then you get the green beans. And then a little bit about the economics of the crop. So it is one of the globally, it is one of the most widely traded tropical agricultural commodity. In 2020-21, the production was forecasted to be about 10.6 million tons of green beans. It's produced in about 80 tropical countries with about 125 million people depending on coffee for their livelihoods. And in 2019-2020 crop, typically the harvesting starts around August, September, and then it goes until March, April. So that is one of your season. So it goes by the 2 years, 2019-2020 crop. And so the US exports accounted for about $17.87 billion and globally about 2.2 billion cups of coffee are consumed daily, every day, and 400 million in just the United States. And then, as I mentioned, about 60% are Arabica coffee and 40% is Robusta coffee. And you can see the Robusta coffee in the darker green areas is Robusta, and the lighter green are Ethiopia is the center of origin of Arabica coffee. And in Kenya, you can see the lighter green is mostly Arabica coffee. And then many countries like Brazil and other African countries and India, they all produce both Arabica and Robusta. And then the history, the spread of coffee, about 6th century, Ethiopia is the center of origin. It was taken to Yemen around the 6th century AD. And in 1450 was the first recorded consumption of coffee as a beverage in Yemen. And then from Yemen, it went to Cairo, and from there to Damascus, and then to Istanbul, which led to the birth of the coffee houses. And then the first coffee house in Europe opened in Venice in 1645, and then in Oxford in 1650. And then by 1663, more than 80 coffee houses were seen in England alone. And then the spread of coffee, first coffee in the US was in Boston in 1689, which was the London Coffee House. And then the first coffee house in New York was in 1696, the King's Arm. And I know when Tim gave the introduction, he mentioned about coffee being a place for social gathering. And even in those old ages, this is the coffee house in the times of King Charles II. And you can see men gathering in coffee places where intellectual discussions happened. And this one here is a coffee grinder that came in the Mayflower. And then the spread of coffee as a plant itself is like in 1690, the seeds were taken from Java, to Java from Yemen. So they were smuggled from, and was grown by the Dutch East India Company. And then from Java, the seeds were taken to Amsterdam Botanic Garden in 1706. And then from Amsterdam, it went to France and to Reunion Islands. So you can see from there is this huge genetic diversity in Ethiopia. And then 575 AD, around 600, they went to Yemen. And then in 1690, went to Java. And then in 1706, one plant went to Amsterdam, which led to the Arabica type of Arabica coffee. And then there was another line that went in 1715 to 18 to Reunion Islands. And from there, it led to the Bourbon variety of coffee. And then the spread of coffee around the world. So this is the two plants, one from the French Reunion Islands, and then from Amsterdam, the Typica line and the Bourbon line. So by the time that from Ethiopia, it spread to other parts of the world, the genetic diversity became very narrow. So in 1720, 2 plants were taken to Martinique in the Caribbean, and then it went to Haiti from there, and then Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Cuba, and then to Puerto Rico. This was in the Caribbean. And then in South America, from Amsterdam in 1718, it went to Suriname, and from there to French Guyana, and then to Brazil. And so you can see from Ethiopia where in 1600, the spread happened in 1600, went to Amsterdam, and then for South and Central America. But Robusta coffee is a more recent expansion. So what happened is the Arabica coffee in many places where it was introduced, they were very susceptible to this fungal disease called coffee leaf rust. So that is what Sri Lanka used to be a coffee producer. And because of the coffee leaf rust, it wiped out the entire crop. So as an alternative, the Robusta coffee was discovered, which was also palatable. And so just before 1900, the Robusta coffee was spread around the world too, where it went to Europe first, and then it went to Asia as well as to South America. And then the processing itself is, there are different methods of processing, the natural or dry process, or there can be a wet, a washed process, and then there is a newer honey process. And then there are all sorts of in-between types that people always experiment with to enhance the flavor of coffee. And then the dry process is a much easier processing methodology, and the wet process requires a lot more steps. So the dry processing, you harvest the cherries, you dry them on a tray, and then once it's dried, you get they get dark, and then you remove the outer skin and the parchment layer and the silver skin, and then you get the coffee. With washed method, so there is more need for equipment. There should be an investment in equipment. So first you get the cherries into a facility. So you bring the cherries, and then you sort the cherries, and then anything it's floated, anything that is floating is removed, and then you also have, when you're harvesting, there are always going to be leaves and other debris. The debris is removed, and then they're floated and washed, and then they're taken into this pulper. And in the pulping machine, the pulp is separated from the inside the beans, and then they are separated, and then the pulp comes to one side, and the green beans go to another side. And then the green beans are then fermented for about 24 hours, and then washed, and then they are dried. And then this is the honey process, which is common in Central America. You can see them in Costa Rica, El Salvador, Panama, and Nicaragua. And they are in between a dry processed and a wet washing, where they are processed, part of the pulp is removed, but some of it is left. So that way some of the sugar flavors can go into the beans. So this kind of shows the difference of a dry processed, wet processed, and honey processed. And then once you have done the processing, then it is dried, and then you hulled, and then you usually have a hulling machine which removes the silver skin and the parchment out of the coffee. And then they're sorted, bagged, and then stored. They store for about at least 6 weeks before they can be used for roasting. So they usually the coffees are sold in a wholesale market. They're sold as, these coffee beans are sold as 60 kilogram bags. So when you see a lot of these trade journals and all that, when they talk about millions of bags, it is like 60 kilo bags. And then the roasting, there are so many different types of roasting. I mean, when you go to a grocery store and you look at the different coffees, you get the light roast, the medium roast. So the light roast, there are the cinnamon and the light roast. And here you get the actual flavor, what you call the terroir. It's like wine, where the soil, the climate of the region where it's grown, all those have an impact on the taste of the coffee. So the lighter the roast, you are able to get those nuances of the origin of those coffees. And then you have the medium roast. So there is, I don't know if any of you have done your own roasting at home, bought green coffee and done your own roasting. But when you're roasting, at a certain point, you hear this first crack. And then a lot of these medium and light roast, you stop them after the first crack. And then you have the city roast, which is a little darker. And it also, you still get the taste of the origin. And then you have the darker roast, the full city roast, Vienna roast, French roast, and then the Italian roast. And then here you stop you at the beginning of the second crack. And then, so here it becomes a lot of those origin, by the time you get to a dark roast, a lot of those origin flavors are lost, and you get the taste of the roast more than the taste of the coffee origin itself. And then once you have roasted, there are these are a couple of roasting machines. You get those larger roasting machines based on the size of your operation, or you can also have those sample roasters. A lot of people do the sampling using these smaller roasters. And then once the coffee is roasted, then you have a grind. You can either buy them ground in the store, or you can buy the coffee and grind them at the store, or you can have your own coffee equipment at home where you can do your own grinding, which is the closer to drinking your coffee you do the grinding, the better the taste is going to be. And then there are all sorts of equipment for brewing. So it all depends on individual taste and how you like your coffee. So, we have those individual pod coffee makers, and then there is the Italian coffee maker, drip coffee, and then this is also pour over coffee. So all sorts of equipment. And then the coffee tasting, there is the coffee taster's wheel, the flavor wheel that was developed by the Specialty Coffee Association and World Coffee Research. This was published in 2016. Before that, they had been using a taster wheel, which was not scientifically created. And so this was the first scientifically created coffee tasting wheel. So the coffee tasting, it's a science. It's a very qualitative, but but you can make it quantitative by using the taster's wheel. So typically when a cupper, you call them cuppers, where they cup the coffee, and then you get these points. You attribute points to all of the different types of, like it would be aroma or flavor. So there are different categories. And so typically there are 3 from the same lot. They would do 3 cups and then pour water and then take the spoon, they slurp it and then taste the coffee. And then based on that, they give points. Any coffee that is 80 points or higher will be labeled as specialty coffee. Under 80 is then commodity coffee. And then there is byproducts. So you get a lot of byproducts. The coffee, once you have done your processing, the coffee pulp, they can be composted and used back in your farm as organic fertilizer. And then a little bit about coffee and climate change. Coffee is very susceptible. They are very discriminating in which environment they grow in. So loss of a suitable habitat is going to be one of the biggest threats to coffee due to climate change. In Ethiopia, about 65 to 100% reduction in bioclimatically suitable localities by 2080 is predicted. And then in Sierra Madre de Chiapas in Mexico, climate model shows a temperature increase of 2.1 to 2.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. And with also that is going to be drought and a decrease in rainfall. And then Brazil and Vietnam also will experience significant reductions in area that can be available to coffee. And then also climate change will lead to increased pests and diseases. Coffee berry borer, which is a small beetle that bores into the coffee, is one of the threats all over the world. And then this is the coffee berry borer in my own farm in Jamaica. You can, by looking at the hole, you know that there is the hole. You can see that that this has been infected by a coffee berry borer. And when you open the berry, you can see the damage inside the fruit, inside the seed. And then coffee leaf rust is another problem, which is as I mentioned earlier in Sri Lanka, that they had to convert to tea because of coffee leaf rust. And the coffee leaf rust, we had a huge epidemic in 2012, 2013, where Mexico lost about 60% of its streets, exhibiting 80% defoliation. And there were crop losses in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and worth about $500 million. And then a loss of 374,000 jobs in the coffee sector. And then so they're adapting to climate change. Coffee in its natural habitat in Ethiopia is a canopy tree under the forest shade. So they are adapted to shade. And so over time, we have gone into not using shade at all. And so shading will become a critical component of coffee farming, and also planting in higher densities closer to each other. So that way the soil can be kept cooler, and irrigation will have to become a reality. And I have experienced coffee drought in my own farm. For the past 4 or 5 years, drought has been more and more during the summer months, May, June, July. The drought has been pretty severe, which leads to loss of crop, as well as early ripening and also loss of flavor. But the problem with irrigation is a lot of the coffee growing regions are very hilly, slopey regions. And in those regions, to have irrigation, it's going to lead to erosion as well. And then breeding, using breeding with other species, other Coffea species that may have drought tolerance, and looking at genetic components of drought tolerance and incorporating them into breeding programs. And so this was a paper published by recently, this just came out last year, 2019, by a friend of mine, Aaron Davis at Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. And he has done a lot of work with wild coffee species, and also I worked with him in Madagascar. And he's of all that, at that time there were 124 species. Recently, he named 6 new species in Madagascar, bringing the total to 130 now. With the 124 species, 60% are threatened with extinction. 45% are not in any collections, ex situ collections, like in what we call gene banks. And 28% are not in any protected areas in the wild. And so, production by 2050, currently we are using about 2017-18, about 160 million bags of coffee. By 2050, our demand is going to increase to about 300 million bags of coffee. And so really, we really need to find a way to meet this demand for coffee, because with climate change, there are so many challenges faced by coffee. And so that was one of the reasons, in collaboration with World Coffee Research and the Global Crop Diversity Trust, we developed the Global Coffee Conservation Strategy in 2016 and 17. And I was one of the main coffee scientists working on the Global Coffee Strategy. And so as part of the strategy, we identified 6 high priority actions. We really need to, so coffee cannot be conserved as seeds. So they have to be conserved in what we call as field gene banks. This is a field gene bank in Ivory Coast. And so it is very much like a botanic garden, where we have what our botanic garden collections are what we call ex situ collections. So that is what these gene banks hold. They're specifically for coffee. They have all these different varieties or collected from different locations, conserved in these gene banks. So we really need to, and all of these gene banks are in resource poor countries, and we need to find ways to, we need to secure funding for all these gene banks, so that way they can upgrade their facilities and capacity. And also, a lot of the countries, it contributes to the GDP of those countries. And so there is not a lot of sharing going on between countries. So we need to really come up with an access and benefit sharing regime for coffee germplasm exchange. And we also need to link collections through information sharing. There is no database that identifies what everybody has. So if we don't know what everybody has, there is no way that we can also exchange information or share germplasm. So we really need to link all these collections, and we need to duplicate them in other locations. An example is in Madagascar. One of the gene banks, a cyclone came through and wiped out the entire collection. So that is why we really need to make sure they are duplicated in other locations, either within their own country or in other countries, in order to secure these collections. And also we need to do complementary in situ collection, because in situ in the wild is where they are evolving with the climate. So we really need to ensure that these areas are protected and that these plants in the wild are not lost. And so we had a workshop that was 2016 and 17. We got USDA Foreign Agriculture Service funding to hold a workshop to bring all those stakeholders together. And we were supposed to have it in 2020 in Ivory Coast, but because of COVID, we had to pivot and do a online workshop this year to use up the funds. So we had the workshop, and we had 54 participants from 16 countries, and the time zones, we had to work from Hawaii at 2 a.m. to India at 5:30 p.m. So it was a broad spectrum of people that were involved in this. And we published a report following the workshop, but we still have to find ways to raise money to implement what came out of this workshop. And so the Global Coffee Conservation Strategy is available either on the World Coffee Research website or the Crop Trust website. It's about an 89-page document that anybody can download from these websites. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the coffee research work that I've done in South Sudan. So in addition to Ethiopia, South Sudan, the Boma Plateau of South Sudan was postulated as being another center of origin of Arabica coffee. And Thomas in 1942 and Meyer in 1964. There's always talk about Mount Marsabit in Kenya, but that is really not a center of origin. It was introduced to those forest areas. And so in 2012, we had, through World Coffee Research, received USAID funding to go to this location in the Boma Plateau of South Sudan that Thomas had been there in 1942. So 70 years later, in 2012, we were the first expedition to go to this forest in South Sudan. Mainly our objectives were to assess the genetic diversity of the wild and cultivated populations in South Sudan and make recommendations to establish a field gene bank, and also to compare the South Sudanese populations with Ethiopian populations to see how different or same they are. And so at our expedition from April 8 through 13, 2012, and these were all the locations we landed, and the plot 27 was where we had a chartered flight that landed, and then we had to hike up. 30 was where our camp was. So that, and then from there, these were all the locations in the forest that we traversed over those 4 days. And this is again another map of the locations that we went to. And this is the maximum potential of where coffee can be. But you can see over time, these were the locations we visited. And these are all locations where the forests have been lost between 2000 and 2020. And so this is just some nice pictures of our trip to South Sudan, where we were camping. And so we had to go to Juba, is the capital city of South Sudan, where we went and bought pots and pans to do our own cooking while we were camping. And then this was the chartered flight that took us from Juba to Lower Boma. And then once we landed in Lower Boma, we had to hike up to Upper Boma. It had just rained. It was the end of the dry season. It had just started raining. And there were a lot of mangoes. And while we were hiking up to our location, a lot of the local people were collecting mangoes and bringing them down. And this was a camp. It was two Kenyan women who were operating a school. And so they had these huts, and we camped in that location. And this was our only water source, where we would pump water even for a bath or shower, our little bathrooms here. And also for drinking water, we had a filter, ceramic filter that we used to filter to drink the water. And then every day for the 3-4 days we were there, we hiked up almost every day. It was like about 38, about 90 to 100 degree Fahrenheit temperature. It was really hot. And we would hike about 9 or 10 kilometers every day looking for the coffee. And this was the first location where we stopped and collected cultivated coffee. There used to be the farming communities there were cultivating coffee. And so this is, I was doing the genetic diversity study at the Denver Botanic Gardens. And so what I had to do was I had silica gel bags where I would collect some leaf tissue to bring back so to extract DNA. And then when we went into the forest, the first day we went to the forest, we could not find the coffee trees. And then the second day, we had actually armed guards with us. So South Sudan was separated from Sudan in 2011. So it is the most recent, newest country that has formed. So 2011, so that's why the USAID funding was to establish the agriculture sector in South Sudan for a newly formed country. So there was still conflict happening between Sudan and South Sudan. And so we had armed guards with us throughout our trip. And so this was the first wild tree that we found, the Arabica tree that we found in the forest. And then once we saw that, we found many seedlings in the forest floor. And then this is negotiating with the village chief there to access to the forest itself. And then, so in 1942, when Thomas went to the same forest, he found like these trees growing to 18 feet high with a circumference of over 7 inches. But when we went, I mean, we could see climate change impacts in these forests. Many of the trees, we didn't see, I mean, the tree that we saw was a measly little tree which had just some leaves on the top. And so, and there were a lot of seedlings, which was puzzling because there was no fruit production in any of the trees in the forest. And so these were the different cultivated location and the wild locations that we collected. And this one village had 3 trees that this lady had collected in the late 40s. She said when she was a child, she went and collected at the British plantation. So there were the 3 trees that I collected leaf samples from. So this is the genetic diversity study. I'm not going to go into details, but I just wanted to show that of all the things that we collected, the Bayan cultivated is the one I mentioned, the 3 trees that the woman said that it had cultivated, had come from a plantation that was called British plantation. And then as a control, I have 2 plants in our Denver Botanic Gardens. I threw them in as controls, and the Bayan cultivated was very similar to the cultivated Arabica coffee that we have in the Denver Botanic Garden. So they came as a separate cluster in cluster 3. And so we wanted to explore, okay, these are, and our cultivated variety are the typical variety that are in cultivation everywhere. So that which had origins in Ethiopia and then through Yemen. And so we wanted to see how do these South Sudanese plants through all the Ethiopian varieties that are in the gene bank in Costa Rica, the Katia gene bank in Costa Rica, and as well as a lot of the worldwide cultivated varieties. So we wanted to compare. And you can see the South Sudan came up as its own separate population, which is very diverse and distinct from what is cultivated around the world, as well as what is in the Ethiopian forest. So we are just publishing a paper. This paper, even though we did this work back in 2012, it took us a while to get all the results and everything together. And it is right now in review. Actually, the review has been, peer review has been done and the article has been accepted. And it is going through the proofing stage and should be published very quickly. So we are confirming and validating South Sudan also as a center of origin of Arabica, which is huge because up to now we have only discussed as Ethiopia being the center of origin, but now opening up at South Sudan as a center of origin, there are many implications for conservation as well as coffee crop improvement. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for attending this webinar, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will turn it over to Tim to moderate questions. So,
thank you, Sarada. Fascinating talk about this plant I use every single day in my kitchen. Can't live life without it. We have a couple of questions about processing, and just a reminder to our participants, if you use the Q&A button, you can leave questions for us. I might try to bundle a few of these. So can you talk a little bit about how the drying method impacts the quality of the coffee? And then can you also define that first and second crack? What are those two terms that you used?
Sure. The drying, the flavor is a little different. So if you're drying with the pulp on it, it tends to be a little bit more sweeter when you do the dry processing. But for a lot of specialty coffee, the washed processing to get a higher scoring with flavor and aroma, the wet processing has been the preferred way of processing. But I think with the sustainability and environmental impacts taking into consideration, more and more everybody is looking at alternate ways where you're not wasting that much water, because the wet processing requires a lot of water to process it. So I think it is a lot of it is a taste and acquire how you feel, I think. And over time, a lot of people have come up with the honey processing is they do this. I know friends who do what they call carbonic maceration. They use different types of yeast to do the fermentation to improve the flavors. So now people are getting more innovative in the specialty coffee industry to develop all these flavors. So dry processing or wet processing, maybe, in India, it's all commodity coffee. They do the dry processing. They don't have to go through the washing method because you have to invest in equipment. So a lot of the commodity coffee are probably dry processed, but specialties are mostly wet processed. And with regards to the crack, I would recommend any of you to try roasting your own coffee in a pan in your house, if you can get green coffee. And when you're roasting, you can really hear the crack. You will hear like a popcorn, you hear the popcorn popping. It's very similar to that. You hear the first crack, and then the second crack happens once it is roasted a little bit more. So yeah, that's what the crack is.
Can you, another one of our participants asked, can coffee be seed banked?
They cannot be seed banked because they don't take the viability about 6 to 12 months. More than that, coffee viability it is not viable after that. And also they don't take the cold temperatures, like putting it into a freezer and storing, but you can do cryopreservation. So there has been cryopreservation. Actually, the Fort Collins, the Gene Bank, the National Laboratory for Genetic Resource Preservation, the USDA, they do have about 300 or so accessions from the Cartier Gene Bank that have been cryopreserved. So there have been tissue culture methods that have been developed post cryopreservation. You can take it out of so there is still a lot of work that needs to be done to figure out the cryopreservation, because if it is post cryopreservation, if it is only going to be 20% survival, then it is really not a backup. But it can only be a backup. It will not be the only way of saving coffee.
Do you think that the center of origin in South Sudan is from a separate allelopolyploidization event rather than the Ethiopian C. Arabica?
I think it may be all one location. That whole area, Afro-montane forest, used to be one. And then over time, countries separated and habitat destructions have happened. And over time, probably the genetic diversity distinction is probably due to more to isolation rather than different origins. That's what I would think.
What are the implications of climate change on small farmers? How will individuals, families, and communities be affected? And I might add a little bit to this. I'm curious what, as end users, what are the things we can look out for, or what should we be doing if we want to be thinking socially and environmentally when we're purchasing, drinking coffee?
Yeah, this has huge impacts for smallholder producers, because coffee is one of those two. The price volatility also impacts coffee farmers because prices always it is the price that is paid to the farmer does not even cover the cost of production unless you are a specialty grower. The commodity price it used to be less than $1 per pound, per kilo, I think. And then it has just gone up a little bit this year, over last year and this year. And I think when Brazil had a severe frost, which a lot of regions in Brazil lost their trees. And it's going to take 3 to 5 years to come up back to production. So there was this, when that Brazilian frost happened, the price of coffee went up. And so the price volatility is always going to be there. And climate change also, I mean, in my own farm in Jamaica, I have seen it firsthand, where coffee production, last year I had very low production. And this year it's a little higher. But, you know, and now as we are harvesting, it's a rainy season, it's raining quite a bit. And if it's raining, I can't go pick coffee, then I'm losing coffee on the tree. They fall down and we lose coffee. And so a lot of the small producers, that's why agroforestry is a way to, as part of a climate adaptation. A lot of the farms, especially in Central and South America, have gotten rid of shade trees. But by bringing back shade trees, which are also useful, can add income to the farmer, is a way to look at also reducing the soil temperatures and evapotranspiration from the soil, and also adding another crop to your farm. A lot of these countries also do banana as a second crop for shading, but also you can probably had higher cash value trees also. And as consumers, I would say, like, you know, go to a specialty coffee store. You know, commodity coffee is there in bulk, but then you know it's coming from a smaller farmer. All these specialty coffees, micro lots. So then you know that you're supporting a specific farmer. A lot of times these days, specialty coffee, they put farmer information on there or where origin comes from. And traceability is becoming a big issue with blockchain technology. And there is, like, with the International Women's Coffee Alliance that I work with, we are looking at women's coffee. How can we trace it back to say that this coffee was grown by a woman? So traceability is a huge issue that is being dealt with in the coffee industry.
That's a great transition. One of our attendees had asked, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing at your farms in Jamaica, and also that they'd like to learn a little bit more about your work with women in coffee producing regions around the world?
Sure. So I am in Jamaica. I am in the Jamaica Blue Mountain region. And so the coffee that comes out from my farm is trademarked as Jamaica Blue Mountain. And Jamaica Blue Mountain is one of the most expensive coffees. It sells for about $50 or $60 a pound. And so, yeah, I'm going, the problem, because of the trademarking, it is controlled by the Jamaican coffee industry, which is now, it used to be the Coffee Industry Board of Jamaica. Now it is called the Jamaican Agriculture Regulatory Agency, JACRA. And so the trademark, so anything that I sell has to go through the JACRA, and they put the seal that this is Blue Mountain coffee, and only then can I export it from Jamaica. And so because of that, because of the taste, they only allow typical variety. As much as a coffee researcher and a coffee scientist, I would love to research and do trials of different varieties on my farm. The Jamaican industry will, the government will not allow me to do that. So I'm restricted in what I can grow as a coffee farmer in Jamaica. And I've had meetings with the Ministry of Agriculture and the JACRA agency, because we are shooting ourselves in the foot if we are just relying on just one variety, because without diversification, it can, I mean, the coffee leaf rust, I mean, I'm always, you need to control coffee leaf rust, coffee berry borer. Those are big issues. And then what was your second question? Oh, with the women in coffee. So the International Women's Coffee Alliance, we have 28 chapters around the world, and we are organized as chapters, and they are within the chapters itself, each country, they are self-organized. So because they know the country context, so they can work within the country context on their issues. And so as global, we provide resources for them to achieve their goals. And so when I just came on, I really did a survey of all the different chapters to really understand what are the priority needs of all the chapters. And the number one that came out was market access. So a lot of these women are small producers, and small producers, unless if they're part of a cooperative, it's so hard for them to export coffee out of their country. And a lot of importers here, they want to import coffee by containers and not in small batches, which is not profitable to an importer in developing countries. So market access, so that is going to be my priority over the next year, to come up with a program for market access of what is going to market access for women in coffee look like. And then another one was finances, I mean, access to finance for women. in a lot of African countries, women are discriminated against. Don't get access to finances like men do. So because they don't own the land, women have land ownership is not common among women in a lot of the developing countries. And then other one was a lot of voluntary sustainability standards, because there are so many voluntary sustainability standards like Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade, and all of these 4C and things out there. And it can be very confusing to a consumer and for a producer and a consumer. So that is one of the things. And so that was number 3 and the priority that came through the survey was understanding voluntary sustainability standards. So over the next year, I'm going to do webinars to teach, to provide educational opportunities for people to learn, producers to learn about all of these different VSS.
Great. We'll do 1 or 2 more questions. And then just a reminder to participants, Dr. Krishnan has agreed to answer questions that go unanswered live afterwards. So we'll be capturing any questions that aren't answered and we'll be sending responses back out to everyone. This question is, what does the funding landscape look like for climate change adaptation strategies? And on a similar note, is government funding equally accessible to all sizes of farmers, or does funding predominantly come from buyers exclusively for their buyer-driven supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, it's always, there are so many organizations that are all vying for funds from these limited pool of funders, but no, government organization, there is the International Coffee Organization. And so they put together, it is that each country has a representation. They become a member of the ICO, and it is a governmental organization. It's government driven. And so they have public-private task force that they have initiated, and gender becomes one of it too. And so within that, it's not climate change, but like living wage is one of their task force, one of their, they have a living wage, prosperous income. Living income is one of their criteria that they're working on, a sustainable production. And so they have different, so they're looking at ways partnering with the different organizations to implement these. And on the gender side of it, we are partnering with them to make sure that the gender dimension is part of the conversation. And then there is the International Trade Center, and I just signed an agreement with MOU with the International Labor Organization. And because the occupational safety and health is a big issue where women are always left out of the training. And so we are going to develop training programs for women on occupational health and safety. And so funding itself, I mean, USAID or USDA Foreign Agriculture Service and GIZ and the German equivalent of USAID have been big funders in the coffee sector. And so, and then the private organizations also, like Nestle, the large company, Starbucks, Nestle, all of them have been in the funding area where they have provided funding for social within the entire sustainability criteria. So climate change also, agroforestry measures have been looked at for funding. So there are different organizations doing really good work out there.
The last question is, why coffee? You're doing amazing work. What led you to focus on coffee?
Well, okay. So I don't know if you saw my thank you. My last slide that I had is my family coffee plantation. I grew up in India, and my family had coffee. I'm third generation coffee farmer. And so we had coffee farms in India. And then when I was doing my PhD, I decided that I wanted to work on coffee genetic resources, and I really wanted to work in Madagascar. And coffee, found out there were 60 species of Coffea in Madagascar. So I worked on coffee genetic diversity of 4 different species endemic to Madagascar. And so that got me involved with the Global Coffee Conservation Strategy, the South Sudan project. And then I decided that as part of my family heritage, I wanted to have a coffee farm. So I decided to buy it in Jamaica. And people always ask me, why Jamaica? And it's a very silly answer because it's English speaking. And so that is my coffee, because I've been since 7 or 8 years old, I've been drinking coffee. And so I think I could say that coffee is in my genes.
Fantastic. Once again, thank you so much. This is a wonderful talk, so very, very interesting. For those of you who asked questions that didn't get answered, I'll be capturing those and we'll be sending those out to you. For those of you who have responded to our survey about your favorite local coffee shop, thank you for that. And for those who haven't, you still have a day. So send us your favorite coffee shops. All right, good night, everyone. Be well.
Thank you.